Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping into a wildly fascinating era of history where the rules of the game were, well, vastly different from today. We're going to discover that medieval Indian political thought wasn't about abstract philosophy or lofty debates about human nature. Instead, it was this highly practical, hard-hitting survival guide for governance. It was developed under very specific historical conditions, specifically the establishment of Muslim rule in India and the blending of indigenous traditions with Islamic political concepts.
Now, to really wrap our heads around this, we've got to completely shift our modern perspective. Today, our political theories love to deal with abstract rights, liberty, and complex philosophical frameworks. But imagine, just for a second, trying to run a vast empire without the internet, without paved highways, rapid communication, or a modern police force. The medieval approach had to be strictly concerned with solving immediate, everyday problems. They needed to figure out how to deliver justice across massive territories, maintain order when threats were literally everywhere, manage deep religious convictions, and ultimately keep society from completely falling apart. It was entirely focused on the rigorous, heavy-handed how-to of effective rule.
Okay, let's dive into this with our roadmap. We're going to systematically explore all the foundational features of this deeply pragmatic era of governance, grouped into 5 key areas: the practical state, kingship, administration, religion, and society. Let's get right to it.
Starting off with Section 1, the practical state, where administration definitely trumps theory.
The state in medieval India was viewed primarily as an administrative machine. It was built for pure survival, not for philosophical debate. In an era of constant territorial threat and internal division, a state that couldn't efficiently collect taxes or quickly raise an army simply ceased to exist. Governance was a gritty, hands-on job. It involved the meticulous collection of revenue to fund the empire, the massive organization of a strong military to defend it, the delivery of swift justice, and the strict maintenance of order. The entirety of their political thought was intricately, and honestly quite forcefully, tied directly to these everyday do-or-die administrative practices.
Moving on to our second pillar, let's see how this absolute need for survival built up the role of the monarch.
Sovereign power was totally and undeniably concentrated in the hands of the king. He wasn't just a figurehead, he was the absolute center of gravity for the entire state. Think about what it actually means for one single human being to hold civil, military, judicial, and fiscal power simultaneously. There was no Supreme Court to strike down his laws, no independent Congress to control the budget. Actually, scratch that, there wasn't even a separate military command. The ruler personally controlled literally every single branch of administration. The entire stability of a vast empire rested squarely on his shoulders alone.
But why did the masses accept this immense, unchecked power? Well, thinkers of the time like Ziauddin Barani promoted a brilliant legitimizing tool: divine sanction. The ruler was considered to be appointed by God, governing in accordance with divine will. And this totally transformed the nature of rule. By framing the king's authority as divine, it meant that obedience to the ruler wasn't just some basic legal duty. It was a strict religious obligation. It turned political rebellion into a spiritual sin, which, if you think about it, was the ultimate control mechanism.
Because of this absolutely concentrated power, the personal character of the individual ruler was incredibly critical. Great importance was attached to personal qualities like wisdom, justice, moral conduct, and administrative efficiency. Remember, there were no constitutional guardrails to protect the people from a bad leader here. A weak, incompetent, or immoral ruler wasn't just facing a bad 4-year term. They were viewed as an existential threat that would inevitably lead to civil war, foreign invasion, and complete societal collapse. So the stakes for personal competence were unimaginably high.
Okay, Section 3, the machinery of state. How did this actually work on the ground?
It's a really fascinating reality that justice occupied a central place in this medieval system. But we have to remember this wasn't about modern human rights or fairness as we think of it today. It was fundamentally about preventing chaos. The ruler acted as the highest judicial authority. Medieval thinkers firmly believed that impartial justice physically strengthened the state's foundations, while injustice was like a disease. It would rot the state from the inside out, leading directly to disorder, peasant rebellions, and the empire's inevitable decline. To manage an empire of this scale, they had to support a massive, deeply centralized administrative chain of command. The king needed thousands of ministers, nobles, and regional officials to collect taxes and enforce laws. But this created a really tricky tension.
The king absolutely needed capable ministers to run the empire, but he constantly had to ensure those exact same ministers didn't become powerful enough to overthrow him. Therefore, strict centralization was enforced, ensuring that no matter how vast the bureaucracy grew, the absolute final authority and the power of life and death always remained right with the monarch.
Which leads to a really big question. In a time without modern surveillance, rapid communication, or a digital grid, how did this massive administrative machine actually prevent rebellion and maintain control over millions of vastly spread out people?
The answer lies in the grim reality of relentless law and order. Without the luxury of modern infrastructure, the state had to rely on severe, highly visible discipline and harsh punishments as a primary deterrent to keep people in check. The strict enforcement of laws was seen as the ultimate sign of effective governance. Disorder and rebellion weren't just viewed as local crimes, they were treated as existential threats to the very survival of the state itself, and let me tell you, they were crushed accordingly to set a powerful example. Let's pivot to Section 4, the moral compass, where we look at religion and welfare.
It is absolutely crucial to understand that the modern idea of a secular state simply did not exist. To a medieval mind, separating religion from governance would be as absurd as separating law from governance. Religion and politics were deeply, intimately interconnected. Every tax collected, every war waged, and every major law passed needed a theological justification. Rulers were fully expected to uphold religious values, and state policies were entirely justified through the lens of faith.
Because the king had absolute power, with no separate judicial branch to stop him, religion served as practically the only check and balance on his behavior. Kingship was deeply bound by an ethical and religious basis. Governance involved a heavy moral responsibility, and religious scholars and texts acted as the moral guardrails of the state. Even the most powerful monarchs were theoretically bound by these religious legal practices, which heavily shaped how administrative and judicial duties were actually carried out on a daily basis.
Finally, Section 5, Society. What was life actually like for everyday people under this massive system?
This reveals the ultimate medieval social contract, and it's a striking paradox to our modern minds. On one hand, the state provided a deeply paternalistic form of welfare. The ruler was actively expected to protect life and property, maintain peace, and crucially, provide relief during famines and natural disasters. But the trade-off was immense. In exchange for this protection, the public surrendered all political voice. There was zero popular sovereignty. Political power did not come from the consent of the people. Subjects were strictly expected to obey, to work, and to pay taxes, but never, ever to participate.
Modern concepts of equality and individual rights were completely foreign to this worldview. Instead, the medieval political system accepted strict social hierarchy as completely natural and absolutely necessary for survival. In their view, if everyone wasn't locked into their specific social and economic tier, the whole system would just crumble. Equality wasn't a noble ideal, it was a recipe for sheer anarchy. The state actually viewed it as its primary duty to actively preserve this unequal structure rather than dismantle it.
Now, these incredibly strict hierarchical concepts weren't just arbitrary cruelty. They were direct, practical reflections of contemporary realities. We're talking about an agricultural, feudal society with limited resources, constantly under the threat of warfare and famine. This entire system of thought was forged by the desperate need for stability and effective control above all else. In such a harsh environment, survival simply had to trump individual liberty, which is exactly why the focus was entirely on authority, discipline, and administration.
To pull it all together as we wrap up this explainer, we've seen how all these distinct features merge to create a powerful medieval synthesis. It was a system profoundly monarch-centered, deeply religion-oriented, and intensely administration-focused. It valued justice as a tool for order and paternalistic public welfare for stability. But it entirely unapologetically rejected popular sovereignty and individual rights. It opted for a system that prioritized order and survival above absolutely everything else.
I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. We've seen how medieval political thought was perfectly tailored to the harsh survival needs of a feudal era. It kind of makes you wonder, right? Consider how the specific era you live in right now, with its relative peace, technology, and abundance, dictates the exact political rights and structures you've grown up believing are simply natural. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember, keep questioning the world around you.